There is a moment, they say, when the cell door closes for the first time, that the sound changes you. Not the clang of metal, not the echo of footsteps retreating down a concrete corridor. It's the silence that follows, the absolute, suffocating silence that tells you the world has gone on without you. Renee Calloway heard that silence on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1998. She was 34 years old. She had a daughter named Amara who was 6. She had a mother who still ironed her church clothes on Saturday nights. She had a life, small, imperfect, beautiful, and in the span of one verdict read aloud by a man who never once looked her in the eye, all of it was gone. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She just stood there in that courtroom in Columbus, Ohio, wearing a navy blue blazer she'd borrowed from her sister, and she said 2 words, barely above a whisper. She said, "I'm innocent." Nobody believed her, and that is where this story begins. But before we go any further, if this is your first time here at Fireside Tales, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because every single day we bring you real stories of real people. Stories that will shock you, move you, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And if you've been here before, you already know we don't do surface level. We go all the way in. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is one of the most powerful stories we have ever told. Stay with us until the very end, because the twist in this one nobody saw coming. Now, back to Renee. This is not just a story about a woman who went to prison for something she didn't do. It's a story about what they take from you when they lock the door. It's a story about a man who knew the truth and chose silence. It's a story about a system that moves faster than justice and slower than mercy. And it's a story about what happens when a woman who has lost absolutely everything decides she has nothing left to lose. Because 22 years later, Renee Calloway walked out of the Marysville Correctional Institute on a Thursday morning in March, wearing a gray sweatshirt and carrying everything she owned in a single plastic bag. She was 56 years old. Her hair had gone silver. Her daughter was grown and had children of her own. Her mother had been buried 7 years prior, in a cemetery Renee was not allowed to attend. And Renee Calloway, this woman who had been swallowed whole by the American justice system, looked up at that Ohio sky and took a breath so deep it looked like she was trying to inhale the entire world. Then she got to work. But to understand what she built, you first have to understand what was taken. And to understand that, we have to go back. Back to Columbus. Back to 1997. Back to a woman who was just trying to survive, and a man who decided that her survival was a threat to his own. Renee Denise Calloway was born in 1964 in a neighborhood on Columbus's east side that the city planners had long since stopped caring about. Her father worked at a GM plant. Her mother, Gloria, cleaned houses on the north side and took in alterations on the weekends. They were not rich. They were not comfortable. But Gloria Calloway ran a household with a kind of fierce, organized love that made poverty feel like a temporary condition rather than a permanent address. Renee was the middle child of 3. She was bright in the way that certain kinds of intelligence don't get recognized in certain kinds of schools. She read everything she could get her hands on. She had a memory that her teachers called uncanny when they bothered to notice at all. She graduated from high school in 1982, enrolled at Columbus State, worked nights at a hotel front desk, and was 18 credits from a business degree when her father had his first heart attack and the tuition money had to go somewhere else. She didn't go back. Not right away. Life filled in the space where school had been. A series of jobs. A relationship that lasted 3 years and ended badly. Her daughter Amara, born in 1992, the product of a brief reconciliation that proved the relationship had been right to end. Renee raised Amara largely alone. She worked in accounts payable at a medical supply company. She was good at numbers. She was methodical, careful, and honest in the way that people who've never had enough money learn to be honest because they understand exactly what dishonesty costs. She was not a perfect woman. She made mistakes. She trusted people she shouldn't have trusted. But she was a good mother and a hard worker, and she had never, not once, stolen anything from anyone. And then she met Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 41 when Renee met him at a church fundraiser in the fall of 1996. He was biracial, the son of a black father and a white mother from Cincinnati, handsome in a way that read as confidence, soft-spoken in a way that read as thoughtfulness. He ran a small property management company. He drove a clean car. He spoke about his deceased wife with what seemed like genuine grief. He was kind to Amara from the very first meeting, crouching down to her level and asking her what her favorite color was like she was the most important person in the room. Renee had been alone for 4 years. She was cautious, but Marcus was patient, and patience, she would later say, was the most effective weapon he had. They dated for 6 months before she moved into his house. A nice house, a colonial on a quiet street in Westerville, with a yard for Amara and a kitchen with an island and a guest room that Marcus said Renee's mother was welcome to use any time she wanted. It was, Renee would say, the most beautiful home she had ever lived in. And she was grateful for it. Genuinely grateful. Which is exactly what Marcus had been counting on. Because Marcus Webb was not what he appeared to be. What Marcus Webb actually was, beneath the clean car and the good manners and the grief performance for his dead wife, was a man in serious financial trouble. His property management company was hemorrhaging money he had borrowed from people who did not extend credit through conventional means. He had judgment liens against 2 of his properties. He was 3 months behind on his mortgage. And he had, over the previous 2 years, developed a sophisticated side business involving fraudulent insurance claims on properties he managed, a business that required, as these things often do, a fall person. He had been looking for one for a while. When Renee started working part-time in his office, helping him with the bookkeeping she was good at, he began to position the pieces. He opened a secondary account in both their names without her full understanding of what she was signing. He routed certain transactions through her employee ID. He forged her signature on 3 separate insurance documents, a forgery he had practiced with care, studying her handwriting from notes she left around the house. In February of 1998, a fire broke out at one of Marcus's managed properties, a vacant duplex on the south side. The insurance investigation that followed was routine at first, and then it wasn't. And when investigators started pulling financial records, what they found was a trail of transactions and signatures that pointed with devastating consistency toward one name: Renee Calloway. She found out she was a suspect the same way she found out about most things in their relationship, which is to say she found out last. A detective came to Marcus's house on a Wednesday morning. Marcus answered the door. He was calm. He was cooperative. He expressed appropriate surprise. And when the detective asked whether Renee had access to the company accounts, Marcus paused for what felt like genuine reflection and said, "Yes, she handled most of the financial side of things." Renee was at work when he said this. She was sitting at her desk at the medical supply company, processing invoices, completely unaware that the architecture of her destruction was being assembled 6 miles away in Marcus Webb's living room. She was arrested 3 weeks later. The case against her was, on paper, compelling. Her name was on the accounts. Her employee ID appeared in transaction logs. Her signature, the forged one Marcus had practiced, was on documents submitted to the insurance company. And Marcus, cooperating fully with investigators, painted a portrait of a woman who had been quietly running the fraudulent scheme for over a year. A woman he said he had trusted completely and who had used that trust as a cover. He cried during his interview. He actually cried. What Renee had was a public defender named Gary Metz who was handling 43 cases simultaneously and met with her 4 times before trial. What she had was a character witness list that included her mother and 2 co-workers, none of whom knew anything about insurance fraud. What she had was an alibi for the night of the fire that placed her at home with Amara. An alibi that depended entirely on a 6-year-old child and a neighbor who wasn't entirely certain which night she'd seen Renee's car in the driveway. What she did not have was someone who believed her. Not the detective. Not the prosecutor. Not, in the end, the jury, which deliberated for 9 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of insurance fraud and 1 count of arson conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to 22 years. 22 years. Amara was 6 years old. She would be 28 before her mother was scheduled to be released. On the day Renee was taken from the courthouse in handcuffs, Gloria Calloway stood in the gallery and held her granddaughter's hand and did not look away from her daughter's face until the door closed. The early years in Marysville were the years Renee did not talk about easily, even decades later. She talked around them the way you talk around a wound that's healed wrong, carefully, with awareness of where the tenderness is. What she would say is this. She spent the first year in a kind of freefall. She spent the second year angry, a rage so total and consuming that she said it felt like something living inside her, something that needed to be fed. She filed her first appeal in her third year, handwritten, 17 pages, citing ineffective counsel and newly discovered evidence. Specifically, her own analysis of the transaction logs that she said proved the timing of certain entries was inconsistent with her access records. The appeal was denied. She filed another. That one was denied too. Amara came to visit with Gloria every other month for the first 4 years. Then Gloria's health started to decline and the visits became less frequent. Then Amara started high school and had a life that was pulling her forward even as her mother remained fixed in place. The visits didn't stop entirely, but they changed. There was a distance that grew between them that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with time, and what time does to people on opposite sides of a prison wall. In 2005, Renee Calloway died of congestive heart failure. Renee was not permitted to attend the funeral. She said later that was the night she made a decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a declaration. Just a quiet, private reckoning with herself in the dark of her cell. A moment where she decided that whatever happened, she was not going to let them have all of her. She was not going to be consumed. She was going to survive this place, and she was going to survive it with her mind intact, because her mind was the one thing Marcus Webb had not been able to touch. She enrolled in every educational program Marysville offered. She got her business degree through an Ohio State correspondence program. She started helping other women in the facility with their legal filings, reading case law, drafting motions, learning the procedural landscape of post-conviction relief the way she had once learned bookkeeping, methodically, precisely, through sheer force of will. She developed a reputation inside. Women called her by a nickname. They called her the accountant partly because of her background, and partly because she had a way of calculating what your case was worth and what it wasn't that saved you from wasting time on arguments a court wasn't going to hear. She was, by any objective measure, doing extraordinary things in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And still nobody came. Until 2011. Until a second-year law student named Priya Nair, working with a newly formed Innocence project at Ohio State, pulled Renee's file on a Tuesday afternoon and spent the next 6 hours unable to put it down. Priya Nair was 24 years old. The daughter of Indian immigrants who had come to Ohio in the 1980s, she had grown up in suburban Columbus, aware of the city's east side in the same vague, distant way that people are aware of places they've never had reason to visit. She had gone to law school because she believed in systems. And she had gone to the Innocence Project because she had started to understand what systems do when they fail. Renee's file disturbed her. Not in the dramatic way of obvious innocence, but in the quiet, insidious way of a case where the math just didn't add up. The timing of the transactions. The signature analysis that had never been done by the defense. The fact that Marcus Webb had received full immunity for his cooperation. A cooperation that had been remarkably complete and remarkably convenient. Priya brought the file to her supervisor. Her supervisor assigned it. And for the first time in 13 years, someone with resources and standing started pulling threads. What they found, as they pulled, was not a single smoking gun. It was something more complicated and in some ways more damning. It was a portrait of deliberate misdirection, of a man who had constructed a trap with considerable care, and of a system that had walked into it without ever slowing down to ask the right questions. A forensic document examiner hired by the Innocence Project analyzed the 3 signed insurance documents and concluded with a high degree of professional certainty that the signatures did not match Renee's known handwriting exemplars. The pen pressure was different. The letter formation in her first name showed a consistent deviation from her actual signature that suggested the forger had studied her writing, but had not been able to fully replicate the involuntary motor patterns that make a signature unique. The transaction logs, reanalyzed, showed access through Renee's employee ID at times when she had been documented as being elsewhere. On 2 occasions, the ID had been used to access the system from a terminal that was physically located in Marcus's private office, a room Renee had rarely entered and had no assigned reason to use. And then there was Marcus Webb himself. Marcus Webb, it turned out, had not disappeared after Renee's conviction. He had restructured, sold the property management company, moved to Cincinnati, remarried a woman named Patricia, who had her own small accounting business. And in 2009, Marcus had been named in a civil suit by an insurance company in Hamilton County, alleging suspicious claims on 3 properties he owned. The suit had been settled out of court. There had been no criminal referral, but it was there. It was on record. And it was the kind of pattern that, when placed beside what had happened to Renee Calloway in 1998, made a particular kind of picture. The Innocence Project filed a motion for post-conviction review in 2012, and simultaneously filed a broader motion for new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The motion was dense, carefully argued, and attached every forensic report, every reanalyzed transaction log, every civil record from Hamilton County. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, which had inherited the case through a jurisdictional quirk, took 14 months to respond. Their response was to oppose the motion. The judge denied it. Priya Nair, who by this point had graduated and joined the Innocence Project as a staff attorney, appealed. The appeals court, in a 2-1 decision, affirmed the denial. The dissenting judge wrote 12 pages that Renee read so many times the printed copy she kept eventually fell apart along the fold lines. The dissenting judge wrote, and these words stayed with Renee for the rest of her life: "When the foundation of a conviction is built on documents whose authenticity has not been rigorously examined, and where the primary cooperating witness had substantial personal motivation to redirect blame, a court of law should be willing to ask whether the foundation is sound. Justice is not served by the speed of our certainty. It is served by the quality of our doubt." Renee was 50 years old when she read those words for the first time. She had been in prison for 16 years. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something that was not quite hope, because hope was a luxury that had broken her before, but something adjacent to it. Something like the recognition that she was not, in fact, invisible. The case caught the attention of a journalist named David Okafor in 2016. David was a freelance investigative reporter who had spent the previous 3 years covering wrongful convictions in the Midwest for a legal affairs publication out of Chicago. He had read the dissenting opinion. He had called Priya, and 6 months later, he published a 12,000-word piece titled The Accountant's Account, which walked through the full history of Renee's case, the forged signatures, the anomalous transaction logs, the immunity deal, the Hamilton County civil suit against Marcus Webb, and the Innocence Project's twice-denied motions, with a clarity and compression that made the injustice legible to people who did not spend their lives reading appellate decisions. The piece went relatively quiet for about 2 weeks. And then a criminal defense attorney in Atlanta who had a large social media following read it on a Sunday morning and posted about it. And then it traveled. It moved through legal communities and then into true crime discussions and then into the broader national conversation about wrongful conviction and prosecutorial accountability that had been building for years. And within a month, Renee Calloway, who had been invisible to the world for 18 years, was suddenly a name that a lot of people were saying. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened an independent review. Marcus Webb, reached at his home in Cincinnati by a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, said through a lawyer that he had nothing to add to what he had told investigators in 1998. His wife, Patricia, reached separately, said she had no comment. The review took 18 months. What it produced was a 240-page report that confirmed the document examiner's conclusions, identified 17 specific anomalies in the original investigation that should have prompted further scrutiny, and concluded that the original prosecution, while not necessarily conducted in bad faith, had relied too heavily on the testimony of a cooperating witness whose immunity arrangement had not been adequately disclosed to the jury. It stopped short of recommending criminal charges against Marcus Webb. The statute of limitations had expired on the original fraud. The Attorney General's office said that while the evidence was concerning, it was insufficient to support new criminal charges. Marcus Webb would face no legal consequences. In March of 2020, the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas vacated Renee Calloway's conviction. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge read his decision in a flat, procedural tone. And when he finished, when the words had been said and entered into the record, Renee sat very still for a moment with her hands folded on the table in front of her. And then Priya Nair, sitting beside her, put her hand over Renee's hands. And Renee Calloway closed her eyes. She had been in prison for 22 years. She walked out of Marysville 3 days later, on that Thursday morning in March, into a world that had changed so completely in the time she'd been absent that it sometimes felt, she said, like being a time traveler. Smartphones, social media, the entire architecture of daily life had been rebuilt around things that did not exist when she went in. She had to learn, at 56, to navigate a world that had been reordered in ways large and small while she was frozen in place. Amara was there when she came out. Amara, who was 28 now, who had 2 children of her own, who had built a life that Renee had not been present for. They embraced in the parking lot for a long time. Long enough that the correctional officer standing nearby had to look away. There was joy in it. There was grief in it. There was the complicated, aching weight of 22 years standing between 2 people who loved each other and had been separated by something neither of them had chosen. She looked at me, Amara said later in an interview, and I could see she was trying to take in everything she'd missed all at once. She kept touching my face like she was making sure I was real. Renee went to live with Amara in a suburb north of Columbus. She slept in a real bed for the first time in 22 years. She ate food that wasn't institutional. She sat on a porch on a spring evening and watched her grandchildren play in the yard and felt, she said, like someone who had been underwater for a very long time and had finally broken the surface. But she could not stay still. She had never been someone who could stay still. Within 6 months of her release, Renee had connected with 3 women still incarcerated at Marysville whose cases she believed warranted examination. She was on the phone with Priya's office twice a week. She had started speaking at churches and community centers, small venues, informal gatherings, places where women who looked like her were sitting in folding chairs drinking bad coffee and listening because they needed to hear from someone who understood what it meant when the system turned against you. She was not a polished speaker. Not at first. She spoke the way she had always processed things, carefully, precisely, with a kind of measured deliberateness that made you feel she had weighed every word before letting it out. But there was something in her that reached people. A quality of having been through something actual, something real, and come out the other side not destroyed but deepened. By 2022, she had incorporated a nonprofit. She called it the Second Account, a reference to the secondary account Marcus had opened in her name, and also a statement of intention. A second account, a second chance, a second telling of the story, this time by the person it actually happened to. The Second Account provided legal support and advocacy for incarcerated women in Ohio who had reason to believe their convictions rested on false or misleading evidence. In its first 2 years, it took on 11 cases. 3 of those women were subsequently released. 2 more had hearings pending. The other 6 were ongoing, slow, grinding work, the kind of work that required the patience of someone who understood at a cellular level what it meant to wait. Renee Calloway, at 59 years old, understood that better than almost anyone alive. She was not done with Marcus Webb. Not in the way of anger, or not only that. She had filed a civil suit in 2021, alleging fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Her attorney was not optimistic about damages, given that Marcus had structured his assets carefully over the years. But Renee had said from the beginning that the lawsuit wasn't primarily about money. It was about a record. It was about a document, a legal document, an official document with her name on it, that said in plain language what Marcus Webb had done to her. The civil case was still working its way through the courts as of the time of this telling. Marcus Webb had still not spoken publicly. His wife Patricia filed for divorce in 2021, 6 months after David Okafor published a follow-up piece in a national magazine. Their house in Cincinnati went on the market in early 2022. Whether Marcus Webb would ever face any formal accountability for what he did to Renee Calloway, for the 22 years he let her serve for a crime he committed, remained, at the time of this story, unresolved. Some things stay unresolved. The world doesn't always organize itself into clean verdicts. Justice, real justice, the kind that accounts for everything that was taken, is often a negotiation between what you can prove and what you know, between what the law allows and what a person deserves. Renee Calloway knew this better than anyone. She had been educated in this knowledge by the hardest possible curriculum. But here is what was not unresolved. Here is what was certain. On a Saturday morning in the fall of 2023, Renee Calloway stood in a community center in Columbus's East Side, the neighborhood where she grew up, a few miles from the house where Gloria used to iron church clothes on Saturday nights. She was standing in front of a room of about 80 women. Some of them had family members inside. Some of them had been inside themselves. Some of them were young enough to be her grandchildren, and some of them were old enough to have lived her exact story. She stood at a folding table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and she talked for an hour. She talked about the cell door. She talked about the silence. She talked about what it takes to hold on to yourself when everything and everyone around you is telling you that you are the person they say you are, and not the person you know yourself to be. She talked about her mother. She talked about Amara. She talked about Priya and David and the dissenting judge whose 12 pages she had read until they fell apart. And then she said this. She said, "People ask me all the time if I'm angry, and the honest answer is yes. I will probably be angry for the rest of my life, and I have earned that anger and I am not interested in giving it up. But here is what I learned inside, in all those years when the only thing I had full control of was my own mind. Anger is a fuel. It is not a destination. You can run on it, but you have to know where you're going." The room was very quiet. "I know where I'm going," she said, and she picked up her coffee, and she kept talking. What Marcus Webb took from Renee Calloway was 22 years. 22 years of Amara's childhood that she did not witness. 22 years of her mother's life she could not share. 22 years of her own living, her own choices, her own errors and discoveries and small ordinary joys. All of it forfeited because a man who was afraid decided she was an acceptable sacrifice. What he could not take was the woman she became in that place. Hard-won and clear-eyed and possessed of a knowledge about the interior of injustice that made her more dangerous to the systems that produce it than she could ever have been otherwise. He had, without intending to, made her into exactly the person those systems most needed to face. There are currently more than 100 women incarcerated in Ohio facilities who have filed letters with the second account requesting case review. Renee and her small staff and her network of pro bono attorneys are working through them one at a time, with care, with precision, with the methodical patience of someone who knows that one wrong step can cost a person years they cannot get back. Her daughter visits every Sunday. Her grandchildren call her Grandma Nay. She lives in a house now, a small house, bought with a civil settlement she eventually reached. The house has a porch. She sits on it on good evenings and bad ones alike. She has not forgotten what the cell door sounded like when it closed. She says she won't. She says forgetting would be a kind of luxury she cannot afford. Not while there are women inside who need someone on the outside who remembers exactly what it feels like to be where they are. She says the work is the answer to the question she used to ask herself in the dark of her cell in those early years. The question was, what was it for? Why did this happen to me? What possible reason is there for any of this? She says she doesn't know if the universe organizes itself around answers to that kind of question. But she knows what she has chosen to make it for. And she knows that every woman who walks out of a prison that should never have held her, every case that gets reopened, every child who gets her mother back, that is her answer, imperfect and partial and ongoing and real. Renee Calloway was convicted of something she did not do. She lost 22 years. She lost her mother. She lost the years of her daughter's childhood she will never recover. And she got up anyway. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. So let me leave you with this. We live in a country where Marcus Webb is a free man, where immunity deals and rushed investigations and overworked public defenders and incomplete forensics are not anomalies. They are features of a system under pressure, a system that moves fast and sometimes moves wrong, and too often moves wrong on the people who have the least ability to fight back. There are Renee Calloways still inside right now. Tonight, in Ohio and in every state in this country. People who wrote appeals that were denied. People whose signatures were forged or whose names were borrowed or who were simply the most convenient person in the room when someone needed a conviction. The question is not whether the system works. The question is who it works for, and whether you, sitting where you are right now, think that is acceptable. Renee Calloway has answered that question for herself. She answered it on a Saturday morning on the east side of Columbus with a cup of coffee she never touched and a room full of women who needed someone to tell the truth. What's your answer? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button and drop a comment so more people can find this story. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe to Fireside Tales right now. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop asking who the story is really